Welcome back to Rakota Economics. Today I'm going to give a brief recap of the book Good Economics for Hard Times by Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo. So one of the main topics that the authors start this book on is the idea of making economics great again. They talk about how today in America we have difficulty talking about difficult issues, how there's strong political polarization. They kind of talk about the divide between academic economists and the average American, and how the views between those two groups of people have kind of differed greatly. They talk about improving the language of politics, how in today's society there's a lot of misinformation being spread, and there's usually a political motive behind it. Um, and these ideas kind of relate or kind of lead into how we trust our state and our institutions, just because of all of this misinformation and political polarization being spread. And so I really like this quote they kind of begin the book with. So they say the call to action is not just for academic economists, it is for all of us who want a better, saner, and more humane world. And this is also a quote they used to end the book, but I really like the sense economics is too important to be left to economists. So I've decided to recap this book by breaking out some of the author's main ideas into 8 different conversations because it feels like throughout the book the authors are having a conversation with us readers on these important economic ideas. And so the first conversation is on the topic of immigration. And so they talk about how wage differences don't typically correlate with migration and how people don't really usually want to migrate. I know in society there's a tendency to think people just want to migrate so that they can go to a country that might have better wages or better economic conditions. And the authors kind of talk about how this isn't usually always the case. Most people don't really want to move for economic reasons. And they also talk about another primary idea when it comes to immigration is, especially among domestic citizens, there's a kind of a fear of immigration because they think when people migrate, they might actually lower domestic wages because you increase the supply of labor, um, you decrease the price essentially of labor, and so people who are originally in the country might get paid less. However, the authors talk about how this isn't usually always the case because this increased supply of labor also means if you have more people working in your economy, these people also demand goods and services. And so, yes, initially there might be a small wage effect. However, that's usually offset because these people are also working and also demand goods or services. And so you typically don't see a decrease in wages. So the second conversation that the authors bring up in the book is the idea of international trade. So here I have a picture of David Ricardo, who championed the idea of comparative advantage. Um, and this kind of leads back to that first or second slide where it talked about making economics great again, and how the views of traditional or academic economists typically, or they can vary from the average American. And so, and one example they present of that is on the idea of trade. Most economists are typically in agreement that trade is good. However, the average American tends to have more of a negative view on trade. And so the authors bring up the idea of the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, which basically tells you that trade creates losers. Um, However, their argument is that the standard model kind of underestimates the damage that happens from trade or understates it because it assumes that factors move frictionlessly between industries and regions in different countries. However, one of the reoccurring themes in this book is that the economy is actually sticky. Laid off workers in, for example, a town that's hit hard by imports don't usually smoothly retrain or relocate to other sectors that tend to be gaining from trade. And so they talk about how, trade impacts wealth and it can have very important equality effects when we talk about who gains from trade, both between countries and um, within countries. And they actually present this idea that autarky may not be that bad for the US. Um, Autarky being just the absence of trade. And they talk about how its effects may not actually, in the absence of trade, the U.S. may not actually be that worse off, which is an interesting idea. The third conversation that the authors talk about has to do with likes, wants, and needs. And so this kind of revolves around the idea of self-discrimination. For example, if you tend to think you fall into a certain maybe social category, then you're more likely to um, make whatever those, for example, stereotypes that may surround that social category. You might make those come to fruition just because you think you belong in a certain category. They talk about, for example, echo chambers, how people tend to just follow and consume news that they already agree with. And this kind of leads to increased political polarization, and it makes it harder to have difficult conversations because it makes us less likely to hear or less wanting to hear the other side's viewpoint out. And again, they bring up the idea of reliable news and analysis and how preferences may not always be absolute. Um, they can be changing, and they also talk about prejudices on immigration and how sometimes it has a fairly negative people have a fairly negative viewpoint in the domestic country, at least. Um, yeah. So the fourth great conversation in this book that the authors talk about is the idea of growth. So they bring up the idea of total factor productivity, which is basically some secret component that makes the economy grow. It's not actually secret, but it's basically it's the part of economic growth that tries to measure how efficiently goods get produced. So maybe like technology and ideas and things like that, but that basically things that aren't too easy to measure. It's what's left over after accounting for things that we can measure. And the authors present kind of two different economists that have differing viewpoints on the idea of growth. So they present Robert Gordon and Joel Mokyr. Um, and basically, Gordon is kind of has that pessimist viewpoint, where he kind of talks about in his book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, how the best of America's growth and prosperity is behind us, and he doesn't see us. He sees growth slowing down in the future, and he doesn't see it as a continuing trend. Whereas you have Joel Mokyr, on the other hand, who's an optimist. He thinks we're getting better at inventing, and that we're going to be just fine when it comes to economic growth. Some other ideas the authors talk about in relation to growth is how capital is only productive with labor. Knowledge spillovers in Silicon Valley as an example of that. That kind of ties into the idea of network effects, where if you have a lot of, for example, people who are highly educated in one area, they can there can be increased benefits just from having all those people in one spot because there's knowledge spillover, ideas can get shared, things like that. And then they kind of just present a question about what causes fast growth. Because you see, for example, looking back at history, some countries have grown really fast, whereas you have others who tend to kind of experience slower growth. And so just kind of thinking about that, what could be causing that. So the fifth conversation that the authors talk about in this book is the idea of global warming and how the planet is warming. And so they talk about climate change as a market failure, and how the market, left to its own dynamics, will usually result in an outcome that is not the most beneficial for the long-term health of our planet. They talk about the 50-10 rule on CO2 emissions, which basically says the world's the 10% richest countries in the world emit roughly 50% of the world's CO2, while the poorest 50% emit only 10%. And so they talk about this idea of how these poorer countries tend to experience more damage from climate pollution because they are not as well equipped to deal with these environmental issues. Um, and so you kind of have this effect of these rich countries emitting all of this CO2, but the largest impact of it is actually on these poorer countries who aren't even emitting the CO2. Um, and they also talk about manipulating preferences, which is an interesting idea, going back to the idea that in this case, the market is arriving at an outcome that is not beneficial for the long-term health of our planet. It's basically a huge negative externality. So in this case, is it okay to manipulate preferences if, for example, when we make our decisions every day, we're not taking into account future generations who will rely on the health and prosperity of our planet? Um, and so one idea they kind of present is revenue neutral carbon taxes, just an idea on how to limit CO2 emissions, especially among the world's richest 10% who emit again roughly 50% of the world's CO2. The sixth conversation that the authors bring up in this book has to do with the future of labor in an age of And so the seventh conversation that the authors discuss kind of bounces off that last one of increasing inequality, and it revolves around the idea of taxes. So they kind of talk about how taxes, especially on the rich have gotten very good at knowing how to basically dodge taxes, and they've gotten really good at tax evasion. And so these like wealth taxes may not, or these some of these methods of taxing the rich may not be actually that efficient because they've gotten really good at kind of avoiding them. They kind of present the other side of the coin, if you will, of Milton Friedman on taxation, who is basically there's this quote from him, but basically he's in favor of cutting taxes at any cost and at any time. And so they kind of continue this discussion of the Reagan Thatcher era. You have economists like Milton Friedman who are in favor of cutting these taxes, but then you also have this increasing inequality, and so um, they talk about ideas about how we can use taxation to basically make sure we can restore the legitimacy of the state by decreasing inequality. So the eighth and final conversation in this book is on cash. And specifically, the authors present the idea of a universal basic income and the idea of a universal ultra basic income, or UUBI. Um, and they talk about how universal basic income can be beneficial if it protects the dignity of those being helped. There tends to be sometimes in society a stigma associated with certain welfare or social assistance programs. Um, However, if you can protect the dignity of those being helped and kind of help either remove or mitigate that stigma, it can help these individuals receive help and also not feel shame for getting such help. And so they talked about, like I said, the idea of the universal basic income, which is basically a flat payment to everyone in a society, and then the idea of a universal ultra basic income, which is a smaller payment than a UBI, and it again goes to everyone in society. But the main benefit of it is it is so small that it's meant to just kind of help people a little bit, but I guess the issue with the universal basic income, and especially a UBI that is a high dollar amount, is it's hard to kind of distinguish the poor who actually really need that payment and the rich who, to them, that payment needs nothing or it means nothing. So the UUBI helps with that by making the payment so small that the rich could care less about getting it, but it still is a small support for those who really do need it. And they kind of talk about having a small barrier to entry to receiving money, which can help um, kind of, it's one way to signal who might actually need the money versus those who don't. So one idea they present is like going to an ATM to claim these funds, because those who actually need the money will take that small step to claim the assistance, and then the wealthy who do not need this assistance most likely won't take that small step. So with that, I hope you've enjoyed this short recap of Good Economics for Hard Times. And here's to the next book we read.